Yeah,
Turn your gutters to the.
turn your gutters to the lawn so that rainwater can infiltrate into your soil instead of straight into the water bodies. Hello, YouTube. We're just reviewing last week's. One more thing. One more thing. Uh-oh, I don't want my, there we go. Polish that.
You guys have all submitted your abstract summarizing the.
Yeah, come on, one more thing. All right, the slower we go, the more things we need. So yes, get you in the back there.
They predict that a third of Florida land is gonna be developed by 2070.
A third of Florida's land will be developed by 2070. I was surprised by that because I was like, surely a third's developed already, but I guess not.
Well, maybe they don't mean agriculture, maybe.
So what about like what proportion of Florida land area is in conservation, like in a state, federal, or county protected area? What do you think? You can't answer. Hi, YouTube. We'll get started in just a second. We need an answer, a guess. From someone who hasn't spoken yet in this semester, this seminar. Just guess, you could be wrong. Yeah,
20%?
20%. Higher or lower? If you think it's higher, raise your hand. If you think it's lower, raise your hand. It's actually like pushing 30. Pushing 30% is federal, state, or local conservation.
Federal.
Wow, federal, right? So it's actually one of the highest land areas in conservation. I mean, some of the west or the BLM areas like Idaho and stuff, but like compared to Texas has like 2% public lands. Florida has like pushing 30. So we have a lot of opportunity. So I'm not exactly sure what you're going to tell us about, but we have a lot of conservation lands where science can help inform the management. It's already in federal, state, or local protection. So we just have to figure out how to manage it right. And that can be hard in a developed context. But so with that, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Robert Sharping. You go by Bobby, but Dr. Sharping is a UF postdoctoral associate. He's working with Dr. Elise Morrison here in the Department of Environmental Engineering Sciences. He focuses on the ecology of aquifers, springs, and underwater caves, which is interesting because it's not exactly what you're doing as far as that's right at the moment. So, but you're going to tell us mostly about cave diving, which is exciting. He's really interested in how microbial chemosynthesis occurring in caves influences the nutrient and carbon dynamics of coastal springs. So I want you to make sure by the end of this talk, you understand what chemosynthesis means. Okay, probably he's going to help you understand that. He uses safety-oriented cave diving practices and technical equipment to collect samples, deploy instruments, explore sites, and be safe while doing science. His research has been funded by the National Speleological Society. All right. Who else has been funded by the National Speleological Society? Raise your hand.
I pay them.
You paid them? Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the USGS, and the Cave Research Foundation. So, Bobby, without further ado, the floor is yours. I will hide this, and you should be good to go. All right. That works, yeah. And you should be able to use that. Megan, let me know if the YouTube is streaming okay. Thanks.
Thanks for that introduction, David. Hey, great to see everybody here. This is exciting to have this room full of people that just want to hear about caves, or maybe you're here for class too. So either way. So I guess I'll go ahead and get started. I knew there's a lot of wetland people here, so I thought I'd start with a photo of a salt marsh here. This is a site that I'll talk about later. I'm not studying the salt marsh per se, but what's underneath it. So we'll get to that toward the end of the talk though. So in like broadly for this talk, I'm going to have 3 parts. 2 of them at the end are going to be about my own research, but like you get to a certain point, we're just kind of sick of talking about your own research. And so what I'm going to do for this first part is talk more broadly about how scientific cave diving has informed science generally. So kind of focusing on things that we wouldn't know about nature if it weren't for scientific cave divers. And so for this part, I'm going to be, I'll start kind of most broadly talk about how scientific cave divers have learned about cave formation and in general aquifer geology and hydrology. After that, I'll touch on how this technique can inform sea level and climate science. Beyond that, I'll kind of focus in from geology into biology, talk about how the discovery of species has increased our understanding of like the world's biodiversity, but also our understanding of how evolution happens. And then I'll finish with most specific kind of the human focused archaeology side of this too. Okay, but some obligatory slides. I'm going to be using this term a lot because you all live in Florida. you'll probably heard this term karst. Karst is just referring to a landscape that has bedrock that's been dissolved. Here are a couple shots from Majorca, Spain. It's an island in the Mediterranean. It's a great example of a karstified landscape because you have so much external karst features. But besides kind of external dissolution of limestone and other carbonate rocks, we can have internal plumbing in these systems too. So that's what's being represented by this other picture. And that's probably what you're most familiar with when it comes to think about karst, think about caves, sinkholes, and things like that. So even though this is kind of a niche field of science, these landscapes are really widespread. You can see on this global map that these kind of dark and light blue spaces are places where we have continuous and discontinuous carbonate rocks, which are dissolving, turning into karst landscapes. If you add them all up, this comes to about 15% of ice-free land surface. And what's really cool compared to maybe studying some other types of ecosystems is that this type of environment occurs in all climates and all continents. So we have a lot of really diverse environments that karst is forming. So let me get more specific into this talk. So when we're talking about models of cave formation, it really gets exciting when we think about kind of traditional settings of karst science and more, let's say, non-traditional, like in coastal settings like Florida, the Bahamas, places like that. And so let me start this talk by kind of going over different settings of karstification, karst development. Here's a shot from the Suwannee River. You've obviously probably seen limestone in Florida. Here's some examples of that. It is some pretty spongy, very crumbly stuff. And so compared to maybe some more hard limestones that you're used to seeing maybe in the continent if you're hiking around the Appalachians. So here's Meads Quarry in Tennessee. It's kind of a local dive site around Knoxville. These types of rocks are fundamentally different. Let me explain a bit why too. And we can pass around these. This is a hand sample of limestone from the Obed River, which was in Tennessee by Dragon's Breath Cave. And you can see it's essentially a brick. You can see some grains in it, but basically through being buried and through like what geologists call diagenetic processes, there's been cementation happening that kind of fills in the primary porosity that exists when limestones are first being deposited, right? Who can tell me what type of rock a limestone is? Like of like the three major types of rocks. Sedimentary, very good. So right, remember that these types of rocks are being deposited by just organisms living in marine environments, dying and then depositing their bodies on the floor, the seafloor, right? And so that means when you have really fresh new limestones, they're super crumbly because they haven't really gone through these kind of metamorphic processes that eventually form.
I'm just getting it for the our Zoom folks there.
And so this is an example of a unit of limestone in Florida called the Suwannee limestone. Here's a fossil from the Ocala limestone, which is more common in the caves around Gainesville. This is an echinoderm fossil. You can pass this around too and see the kind of radial
Like a
symmetry.
starfish.
Yeah, starfish or a sea urchin, a skeleton from that. And then this is a hand sample from the Florida Keys, and you can even see the corals still left over in that. So maybe I'll pass that. I don't know where the camera is.
I don't know either. Pass it this way, yeah.
It's kind of around there too. And you can see this is kind of an extreme example where we have just like the
Super porous.
yeah, massive skeletons showing up in the limestone because it just hasn't been changed by burial and other geologic processes. So let me introduce some terms for you from this. So if we want to look at this limestone in Florida or in coastal settings, geologists call this, or at least karst processes in this setting, eogenetic. So it's new in its kind of life cycle, so-called, of the limestone. But what I want you to take away from this is that water stored in eogenetic aquifers can be stored in that primary porosity, that matrix porosity between all the grains that make up the rock, but also from fractures that are forming in the rock and conduits that are developing as the rock dissolves, and so basically forming caves. Okay, now this is different from limestone, for example, in Tennessee, more broadly kind of in a continental mountainous setting. This is called telogenetic, it's at the end of its life cycle. Here, even though you'll have fractures forming as this rock basically through mountain building events comes up, its overburden is like removed. So now all this pressure is gone, so it can fracture and break and then dissolve from there. It's lacking this porosity and it's like in the matrix broadly. And so now we're going to basically through through these geologic processes, plugging up this matrix porosity. So this is going to be a fundamental difference as we move forward and talk about the different settings of karst formation and specifically how like caves form in Florida. Okay, so if we want to represent these two types of rocks and graphically, here's a paper from Basher and Milroy. These numbers aren't so important as much as just think as we move up on this y-axis, we're getting more porous rock. As we move this way, those pores are becoming bigger. And so you can see this is kind of the initial condition when limestones are laid down in their depositional environment. But then and these are the geologic processes I've been hinting at, as that rock is buried and then basically metamorphosed, uplifted through mountain building, fractures and dissolves, is becoming this telogenetic karst system and ends up kind of over here with caves, cavern systems. And that's for kind of that Tennessee limestone. If we're thinking about Florida limestone, it's that eogenetic karst. Basically, we're not going through this process of burial and uplift and fracturing, but instead kind of just going straight towards cave systems. Okay, there's a question mark because it's like, how does this happen? This is kind of a much more recent field of study when it comes to limestone science and karst science. Okay, so if you just Googled cave formation, you'd probably find a figure like this, where you have stream water or rainwater coming down into the limestone, basically as a sinking stream. Once it's down underground, it's dissolving some limestone, eventually comes out in the stream environment. I'm sorry, in as a spring feeding rivers and streams. This is a fine model for like telogenetic settings, but I want to explain why this is not so great for eogenetic settings.
So just for everyone, so it's great for the older stuff, but not for the newer stuff.
That's right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, what I'm trying to do is talk about why Florida is so odd. And so this comes back to that water supply, like stored in that matrix porosity. So most of the water coming out of like our springs in Florida is just coming from the bulk water stored in the aquifer instead of coming in from like sinking streams. So now here's the trick. That water, because it's been stored in that rock for so long, has had time to equilibrate with the aquifer rocks, so the calcite or the aragonite and limestones. So that means it's not going to be chemically aggressive to limestones. So it's not going to be doing any dissolving. I said, so no, what you should, what I'm hoping you're thinking in your head are some like paradoxes. You're like, why is this? What is forming these caves, if not like our classical model? Another part of this is we get some clues from cave morphology. So here's kind of where we insert observations from cave divers that kind of inform this idea. Maybe we can talk about this more if you're interested, but let me kind of move ahead with one particular idea from their morphology, and that's these solutional or dissolutional features. Okay, so what we're going to focus on here are very subtle features called solution scallops. It's all these kind of cuts into the wall here. If we think about how these solution scallops form, what's really handy about these is that they're asymmetrical. So we know that the deep side is representing kind of the upstream side, the shallower side, the downstream side. So we know that from looking at these features, which way the water is flowing that's dissolving this cave in the first place. Okay, and if we look at this picture, we see our diver moving away from me here. The scallops are orienting that way too. And so, okay, this makes sense. Okay, we have water flowing this way that's doing the dissolution. But what's really surprising is that this diver's swimming into spring flow. And so here we have solution features oriented in the opposite way as the water's flowing. And so this is just one more example of how this matrix porosity water, like the main clear, pretty spring water, isn't the stuff that's actually dissolving in this cave in the first place. One more question that should be popping up here. Well, then what the heck is dissolving these springs, right? So let's talk more about that. Okay, so one other feature, and if you study spring ecology or have been like bummed out in the summer when like you're trying to go swim in a spring in some browned out conditions, is this idea that the river, like the Santa Fe or the Suwannee, will eventually get, or sometimes get high enough stage that actually backs up into the spring water and even back down into the cave system. So here's an image. These are both from Little River Spring on different days. On the left of me here, or on the left side of the photo, is the spring water, so clearish. And this, like I've been talking about, is at equilibrium with calcite, which is the main mineral in limestone. This isn't going to be dissolving limestone, But this river water, which is dark, it looks like, I don't know, I'm swimming into space or something, is undersaturated with respect to calcite. So this can be chemically aggressive to the aquifer rocks. And here it is, the same water kind of moving down into the cave system, as you see the Steiger kind of coming into the underground. So this is kind of where we'll move on from here. So let's talk about how this water could have formed these cave systems, or at least enlarged these cave systems in Florida in the first place. So let's talk about this model of cave formation in Florida and kind of these eogenetic coastal limestones broadly informed by cave diving. For people observing this happening and for people also looking at the morphology of these systems, for studying these caves by like actually deploying instruments and collecting samples from inside of caverns, then we wouldn't have this model. So this is why I'm emphasizing this at the beginning of the talk, because it's kind of like it's really cool to have these two things, you know, cave divers and cave science kind of like helping each other out here. So let's talk about this. So think some tens of thousands of years ago during glacial periods, water tables were lower because sea level was lower and the environment was drier. So these voids are forming in the limestone. This is just a cross section of our limestone aquifer. Water tables down here. These voids are forming at the water table. But what's interesting about this, and this is why it's fundamentally different from like that old school model of cave formation, is that these, even though there's like joints or fractures in the limestone, they're not connected to the surface by any entrances. They're just like entranceless voids forming by just limestone dissolving, kind of from a bottom-up approach rather than like a top-down approach. Okay, let's fast forward into the mid-Holocene. Now we have sea level rising, the climate's getting wetter, say this is 5,000 years ago. What's happening now is as that water table rises, those voids are flooded and also surface streams start to form as we have the water table kind of getting at a higher elevation than some topographic lows. Okay, as we go on from here, now we're getting into these spring reversals where we have the stage of the river increasing more quickly during floods than the aquifer stage. And this allows water to move down into the aquifer. This is what's enlarging these conduits because this water is undersaturated with respect to calcite. And basically now enlarging these conduit systems and also forming entrances as like erosional accidents. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that there's no like causal relationship between the entrance and the spring compared to like a telogenetic setting where we have, remember this like kind of representing the same thing as we talked about a few slides ago, the sinking stream forming the cave because it's undersaturated and eventually coming out as the river. As that river goes up and down based on whether it's depositing sediments or just incising into limestones, it's just making different cave passages that represent different baselines of the aquifer. Okay, so compare these two ideas, right? We've got basically kind of a bottom-up formation of caves in Florida that are eventually accessible because of just erosional accidents versus something that's going on in like Tennessee or continental settings. Okay, so now in this last part of the figure, we're at our modern spring cavern or spring cave system. And so what I want to emphasize here, once again, is that this conduit network that's formed under this river isn't necessarily or even at all related to its present hydrogeological setting. I'll back up one second. Here, the fact that the river is here and the fact that we have a sinking stream, these are all related. But when you have a system like Jenny Spring, so here's a room called the Gallery, which is, how many of you been to Jenny? Just to hang out, cool. Okay, and so this cave system runs underneath the Santa Fe River, which is very, very interesting if you're only coming from this old school model of cave formation. In that telogenetic model, river should never be running above conduits, and conduits, I don't put it that way, conduits should never be below rivers. You shouldn't have cave systems just kind of like anastomizing below your drainage systems. And so this is just one more observation that cave divers are making. Hey, we have all these conduits running under rivers, even springs coming out that are connected underground, but coming out at two different rivers, like at the intersection of the Withlacoochee and the Suwannee, and the confluence of those rivers, I should say. And this is only kind of reconciled by a model more like this, more like what Jason Foley was putting out here. Okay, so maybe I'll stop. Any questions so far about this thing? Sweet. So cave formation, cave diving, blah, blah, blah. This is,
So I'll give you a
Yeah,
question. So go
okay.
back to that one for a second. So the sort of, the happy accident of these erosional, connections, I think like is when this sort of the spring discharge become like a spring, if you're on the Santa Fe and you see there's the spring bubbling up, like that is the erosional accident you're talking about, that connection occurred between the aquifer and the surface water? Or is it more, and it seems there's still maybe causal, an element there because it is the conduit for the backflow.
sure, and maybe I'll rephrase that then. So when you're paddling along Santa Fe, you see a spring bubbling up.
Yeah,
Sure, now that void is acting.
Like
functionally
now
as
it
a
is,
spring.
yeah.
Now it is, right? But like basically the way it formed was kind of in the opposite way, right? It's there because of that incision from the river.
but then it begets its own enlargification, if that's.
Yeah, exactly. So then, and this is why we can have conduits. I'm sorry, the solution scalps going the opposite way because it's when that river water is backing up into the spring, going opposite of spring flow.
Uh-huh.
Now that's when that dissolution is happening. And so, okay, that's a great question. Anything else? Cool. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about this next thing, how we can have ideas of like sea level changes throughout geologic time informed by speleothems, which are another word for that is just like cave decorations, like stalactites, stalagmites, flowstones, things like that. One particular example I'll talk about are these. It's a feature called a phreatic overgrowth on speleothems. So that's what it means is that we've got basically water table interactions happening that basically are putting more minerals on the outsides of like speleothems that already exist in the cave. Here's an example of like one of these, or maybe I'm just trying to build up into this. So what you see here at the surface of the water here looks a lot like ice, but it isn't. This is a formation of calcite raft. And so we have this cave water saturated or close to saturated with calcite. When it interacts with the atmosphere of the cave, the air bell or something, it'll off gas CO2, which will create conditions that will allow for calcite to precipitate. And because it does it so slowly, so gently, there's no like movement in that water. We have this raft of a mineral floating on water, which is just nuts. I mean, it's so sci-fi, but it's so cool. But what's useful about this, even though it's neat, is that calcite or aragonite can be deposited onto these like soda straws. So these are all formed from like dripping, but these kind of football shaped formations are like over printed on that already existing decoration. Here's a schematic showing what's going on. Imagine this is like a column or even just a wall. This is that soda straw. And you can see here that as sea level kind of varies up and down, whether it's, probably not the order of tides, but think of maybe on the order of like some thousands of years as we have like a stable sea level stand. This phreatic overgrowth on these speleothems, these deposits of calcite and aragonite, give us essentially a statistical distribution of where mean sea level was, where like 90th percentile high sea level, 95th below sea level, represented in these or on these decorations. So this all makes sense, right? When you're at sea level, you see these, but then when you put out some scuba gear and you go in the water, you see them too. Here's a column with this phreatic overgrowth forming on top of it, showing mean sea level here, highs and lows here. You see this diver down with these pretty large ones. This doesn't make any sense for these to be forming underwater, right? Because it needs that CO2 off-gassing from the form in the first place. So this means that these represent a time when sea level was lower, right? And now sea level has since then come up. And so these POSs, phreatic overgrowth with speleothems, yes, they're very aware of this joke in this field. We can find these at levels throughout a particular cave. These are, once again, pretty common in Mallorca. And then get a good idea of when sea level was higher, when it was lower, and kind of calibrating it to what we see now. And so we're doing things like uranium thorium dating to get a good picture of like when these stands were happening like this.
And they don't redissolve because it's all saturated with calcite. So they are kind of like a record and they are preserved as long as the water's still going through all that carbon.
That's right. That's exactly. Yeah. So then we've got this, it's like this wonderful record of sea level change in the Mediterranean and kind of stuff going on around the world too. So, so one more example. cave diving school, blah, blah. And so let's zoom into a more focused science and biology. So here I want to talk about this particular cave animal. So there's been hundreds of species of animals discovered in caves, which of course increase our understanding of global biodiversity. But what is much more rare than discovery of a new species is discovery of like higher taxon, right? So here we're talking about Eurymipes discovered in the 1970s, first described by Joel Yeager in 1981. This is not just a species of crustacean, but a new class of crustacean. It was previously only known from fossils, and all the existing species are all cave adapted. So even though they used to have a global distribution in surficial environments, today they're all underground, underwater, which is why it took until 1979 to find them. And so people have been studying evolution for hundreds of years, right? But it wasn't until people found these that they can really link crustacean and insect evolution. Let me tell you more about this. And so what this figure is trying to show, let's ignore this for now. This is showing kind of what's happening over, I don't know, ecological and geological time. Let's talk about this tree here. And so what recent DNA analyses have shown from looking at all of crustaceans and all of insects is showing that these Eurymipes are more closely related to insects than they are to other crustaceans. Interesting, right? That you, if you try to think of, okay, now we need to come at this from a cladistic of phylogenetic perspective, where we have now a new clade called Pancrustacea, which is basically including insects, and hexapods is a broader term that includes insects and some of their close relatives. Kind of with this common ancestor with Eurymipes, and this is where they start to nestle into the larger evolutionary tree of other crustaceans, crabs, shrimps, other things like that. And so this is kind of showing that early on we had a branch from the Malacostracoans, or shrimps and crabs and things. Early on, those guys split. Some taxa went into freshwater ephemeral habitats, so think what's going on in Great Salt Lake. And then basically from what might have been a Eurymipede-like ancestor, some of those lineages went down into to become these relic species of Eurymipes today. Others invaded land habitats and became insects and other hexapods. And so, and it wasn't until the DNA sequencing of this cave adapted species that scientists were able to understand the relationship of insects to crustaceans. So anyway, I just wanted to mention this. I thought that was pretty neat. Okay, the last thing that I'll talk about before I talk about my own research is Coscar Cave. This cave is in this part of the coast here. This is in southern France, in the Mediterranean coast of France. It's been described as a bubble of memory. Let me tell you why. So it was discovered by a cave diver named Henri Coscar. The cave, though, this is basically a cross section of that rock that I just showed you. The cave entrance is some 120 feet underwater. And so this intrepid cave diver in the 80s was just exploring different passages, and eventually came up into an air bell that had cave paintings from the Paleolithic. So we're talking tens of thousands of years ago, and just finding hundreds of these art pieces. And these art pieces included hand stencils of the people that were visiting this cave when sea levels were lower, and they could just walk right up into it. They were also representing the animals that they were in the area, but what's very interesting is animals that are now extinct. This has been interpreted as a great auk, and so now we can see what types of animals would have been around at these different climates in the Mediterranean. And so just kind of one more example of, if it weren't for cave diving scientists, we wouldn't have this wonderful collection of things to learn about, our human ancestors. Okay, so this is the end of this part one. Let's stop one more time. Just because I'm going to move on to my own research, but if there's any questions, go ahead.
Curiosity. So what do we think there might have been stencils and hand paintings on the walls all the way up the cave, and it probably just got washed away? And so that means that this area has probably been dry and I guess,
That's right. I'm glad you asked that, because even since people have discovered and started documenting this cave, there's been sea level rise that has been washing away these paintings. And so that means there might have been paintings all the way through this gallery, definitely up in here. And so, so basically in two different periods of human history. People have like lived around this entrance and have made their journey up to into the cave to do their paintings. And so, yeah, that was definitely when sea levels were lower. And so, yeah, there might have been paintings all the way, I think, back down.
What's that distance from the map thing?
I think reading the reports, it's something, I think it's only 300 or 100 meters or so. Yeah, and so not too bad. As far as really stuff, yeah. Okay, any other? But maybe if I was going in there with torchlight though. I think I'd be a little.
Sorry. You called him intrepid, I understand.
Well, in the eighties, right? Like, yeah, now the technology is much improved. So, that's not such a great time. Okay, any other questions? Great. Okay, so that's just to give you a flavor of like how cave diving scientists have contributed to the
You
field.
might be out of batteries on that, so you may just have to click the keyboard back.
Yeah, maybe I'll just like.
Yeah.
Okay, so this first part, I'm gonna talk about work that came out of my dissertation at Sulphur Springs Cave. This is a system down in Tampa, Florida. And it's like, it's so utterly engineered that it's gross. And so, so I just want to start by talking about this, some of the conservation concerns here. And then
You've got
we'll go-
about 20 minutes total.
Got it, okay, thanks. And then, yeah, so and then this. Should go too long. Okay, so let me talk about karst aquifers along coast first. We haven't talked about, or we've been talking about kind of freshwater settings so far, but let's talk about kind of where my expertise comes in, which is like what's going on coastlines. So here we have an interaction between freshwater and seawater, and then basically the formation of these haloclines, these layers of the salinity. You remember when freshwater and saltwater meet, because of their different densities, they don't mix readily. And so, and especially in like slow flowing aquifer environments, you get these really sharp delineations between these different salinities. And so this is termed a subterranean estuary. And actually, Dave, this is why I'm here. This estuaries broadly is my thing, right? And so sometimes we're subterranean, sometimes we're not. And these are important for like coastal nutrient cycling. I'll talk about this a bit later on. I just want to kind of introduce this. And this is kind of a cross section of like the Yucatan and Mexico. What we're dealing with in Florida is a bit more complex, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. Okay, so this is an image of a halocline. They're super cool. It looks like this fiber is in air floating above water, but this is really just salt water down here, fresh water up here. But broadly, my research questions or things I'm interested in is like, what's the ecology of subterranean estuaries, since we can access these with cave diving, like why not study them like from the ecologic perspective? And then what I'll talk about in this segment of the talk is really how these habitats are influenced by human activity. So let's jump into Sulphur Springs. Yeah, basically, the city's using it as like a drainage system, and also a water resource, which is kind of tough. So here's Tampa Bay, right? And so USX up here, go Bulls. And then Sulphur Springs is here, really right next to Interstate 275. If you've driven that, maybe go to St. Pete or something, you've probably seen a white tower as you cross over the Hillsborough River. That's where Sulphur Springs is. You can see in the blue line here is the cave system that runs, I think for a half mile or a mile up underneath US 41. And so kind of interesting that it's just like right under the city. There's connected to a bunch of sinkholes through the city too. Here's one of those sinkholes. This is kind of what you do, right? It's got TVs and tires and all kinds of shit back there. Last time I visited there, they've like, what's a house on top of it? I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And besides kind of this accidental plugging of sinkholes, people as they develop the town have also just like plugged in with concrete because we're like, this is dangerous. And so they just like dump a bunch of concrete. And so it's basically totally changed the hydrology of the system. Here's the spring pool, not so pretty either. It's kind of this other concrete structure. And it's the main thing I'll talk about here is that when the city pumps water from this spring, it drops the pool level by about 1 meter. And so you can see that scum line, that's where the pump's drawn, jumps it down there. The water no longer flows into the Hillsborough River, but it's just like totally sucked up into these
That's
pipes.
for public supply.
Let me, yeah, so and here's a close up, and I'll talk about more specifically what I mean by public supply. So yeah, here's that scum line I'm talking about. Basically, in order to supplement discharge over the Hillsborough River Dam, which is where like 50% of Canada gets its water, the city is pumping up Sulphur Springs water to right below the dam. in kind of this convoluted way. So here's what the spring run looks like as it just flows naturally, into the Hillsborough River. But what the city wants to do during, like dry periods is pump Sulphur Springs water. So here's Tampa Bay, here's the dam, the Hillsborough River is up here, or this is the whole, but the Hillsborough River Reservoir is up here. They'll pump this water, something like 2 kilometers upstream in pipes, and then just like dump it down into the river. So here's that spring water coming out. Here's the dam, which has no water coming over it. And just basically to like mimic the flow of the Hillsborough River. You guys are all like ecologists and geochemists, you know. And so I don't have to tell you why, let's some eyebrows, right? But if we look at some like Sulphur Springs specific problems. So part of this was kind of like this historical literature review, looking at literature all the way back to the 1940s, seeing this is specific conductance, which is like a measure of salinity. We can see this kind of trend of slow salinity increase over time as we go from the 1940s to today. But what I want to point out, what's going on here is something that changed. So early on, the management policy was, yeah, we're going to pump up water for like humans drinking water. Eventually, I guess they realized it's too salty and too gross. And so in 2002, the policy became, we're going to do these diversions to that Hillsborough River. And that's when we started pumping a lot. So you can see now there's a whole new salinity trend. Instead of kind of increasing from this way, also to get this like spike in salinity of the cave. And so some of the questions that were informing this study or motivating this study were, what caused this increase? Mostly because the surrounding groundwater remained fresh, which is like super interesting that like the spring would be salty, but the groundwater below it and around it would stay fresh. And so I won't go into too many methodological details, but looking at the geochemistry, the hydrogeology helped explain this. And but maybe I'll go a little geochemistry since I have a captive audience here. One question besides looking at like how salty is the water is what type of salty is the water. This is something you have to do in aquifer science because you can't just take for granted if the water's salty, it's coming from salt water from the ocean, right? Because you have all kinds of aquifer minerals that we dissolve into the groundwater. And so we can see here is a Piper plot that kind of looks at the major ions, think sodium chloride, sulfate in water, and tell us what signature salts are like dissolved in that water. These are some like baseline references of fresh water in the area. We can see that in 1946, Sulphur Springs starts out as this calcium sulfate type. That makes sense based on the aquifer geology of this area. But as we move into the more recent data, here's 2017. When I was doing this study, it's moving toward this sodium chloride type. This is seawater type. So now this is kind of our evidence that, okay, this is coming from seawater. And so this, plus looking at like seismic reflection surveys, understanding the lithology of this area, helped us put together a model for how the seawater got there. Okay, so this is going to be pumping. Basically, compared to that pretty simple model that I showed you earlier, where you just have like fresh water coming in, saltwater wedge forming below it. In Florida, we have a lot of confining units, fractures, and so we just have like multi-storied artesian aquifers, which leads to some pretty weird things happening. What's really cool is that these fractures can breach these confining units and then therefore like connect these otherwise distinct aquifer zones. These aquifer zones are important not just because they contain different water, but because they have different pressure in them too, because they're coming out and being exposed at different elevations. If you're swimming around the Sulphur Springs cave, you can see saltwater vents, so kind of distinct points that water is coming out of. It supports like a different type of microbial community. This is where chemosynthesis is starting to rear its head. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And basically, this is what's producing this subterranean estuary in the cave in the midst of this freshwater zone. So this really, really heterogeneous aquifer. And also when you have pool levels lowered, you're basically encouraging this upcoating of salt water to happen through these fractures, through this cave, and now delivering salty water to the spring. Okay. There are some other issues going on with pumping in Sulphur Springs. Here's now an image not just looking at like the deep aquifer, but also like what's going on with the superficial aquifer. The superficial aquifer is just these sands that are above the like the Floridan aquifer. Here's where we have our septic tanks and sewer lines. Also, these are basically getting into the lower aquifer from breaches and sinkholes. We also have stormwater streams and stormwater runoff and sinking streams in the area. a long time ago, Sulphur Springs was kind of this tourist destination. Hey, you don't have air conditioning, come hang out here. There's no Disney World yet, so let's go swim in too much clothes and hang out. And so, yeah, this is kind of what Sulphur Springs used to be like in the 1980s, though. They finally closed permanently the school because their fecal coliform counts, these bacteria were just too high. And so they built a pool right next to it. And so what I wanted to know too was, okay, is the relationship, we found out there's a relationship with saltwater pumping, saltwater intrusion and pumping, but is there also a relationship between pumping and like these other forms of contamination? And what we found was that pumping lowered the pressure in this aquifer, so that's represented by the potentiometric surface. We don't have to talk about that too much. But by at least lowering the pressure in this aquifer, you're basically allowing more downward movement of water here, as it kind of like is competing for I don't know, competing for pressure and where the differential between these two aquifers go. So this is so this increased downward leakage, because you're reducing pressure here, is what's introducing these coliform bacteria to the spring. Okay. I won't stop for questions. So let me talk pretty quickly about now this last part, which is the ecology of caves with haloclines. And so let's go back to basics here. Just one more introduction. So food webs is something you're all familiar with. That's probably why you're sitting in this room. Here's a food pyramid that everybody's familiar with. And sunlit ecosystem, we've got the sun shining, primary producers are green and happy, and it feeds basically this cascade of trophic levels above them. Yeah, but all fueled by sunlight energy, which is fueling photosynthesis, which is fixing inorganic carbon into organic carbon. If we look at a dark ecosystem, you have all these like, I don't know, sad slimy animals that don't have sunlight. And so one way to get that organic matter or that energy into these systems is by like the movement of organisms like bats. They'll bring it in and poop, and then you got like whole ecosystems based on that. You got floods and things that bring in this energy physically. But one thing that I like to focus on is, okay, ignoring all the things that can bring in sunlight energy, is this idea of chemosynthesis, which is now using not sunlight energy, but chemical energy to fix inorganic carbon like CO2 or bicarbonate into organic matter. So this is an answer to the age-old, but what is chemosynthesis? It's primary production in dark ecosystems using chemical energy. This has been shown in like deep sea environments, also in subaerial cave environments. This is Mobile Cave in Romania. And there's some studies seeing this in caves in Mexico too, kind of at these haloclines where you have redox gradients, which are fueling this fixation of, or giving energy to fuel the fixation of inorganic carbon into organic carbon. So Sulphur Springs, here's those slimes again, supports chemosynthetic microbes. Basically this water isn't just salty, but it's also rich in sulfide and ammonium, reducing water, hitting or oxidizing water, so that gives microbes at the interface access to both energy laden reduced molecules, but also like electron acceptors, nitrate or oxygen. And so this is a microscope image of those slimes. These are filaments with these vacuoles that are full of like mineral sulfur in them. So these are sulfur oxidizing organisms that are growing at these saltwater pits. Basically, they're taking that rotten egg smell sulfide, oxidizing it into mineral sulfur, and then can oxidize it even further into sulfates, which would dissolve in the water column and kind of be exported from the habitat. If you spend too much time in Sulphur Springs, like as a grad student, you'll be like, God, there's a lot of this white stuff floating out of the cave too. And so here's some Bigfoot images of that. This is that flume that eventually dumps out of the Hill River. Here's some white tufts that are coming from these habitats in the cave. And so me, the curious grad student, is like, wonder how much is actually making into the surface ecosystem, right? We think of surface ecosystems totally driven by sunlight photosynthesis, but what if there's like dark carbon fixation that's also contributing to this too? Some back of the envelope calculations just by some sparse measurements that we made, something like hundreds of kilograms of carbon per year. Some context to this, if we look at like another chemosynthetic ecosystem, this is called the Crab Spa hydrothermal vents on the East Pacific Rise. Jesse McNichol and Stephen Siebert measured something like in the order of tens of kilograms of carbon per year coming out of the spring, I'm sorry, out of this vent into like being exported into just the broad deep sea landscape. And so there's like an order of magnitude difference, right? It's kind of exciting. But some more context is that because Sulphur Springs is such a, I don't know, such a terrestrially driven system too. Like this is significant in the deep sea because there ain't nothing there, right? In the terrestrial system, especially one like underneath the city that's using it as a sewer, we're just not, these chemosynthetic products are only accounting for like less than 1% of the total organic carbon coming from Sulphur Springs. So just like in this setting, it's just not that important, even though it's like exciting, like to a grad student.
It's neat, but you could compare it to like if you're on a river and there's algae growing and aquatic plants and they're being exported down to the next part of the river or into that, like it's growth in the sunlight. So this is just the same thing, except it's this sort of cryptic
Yeah,
primary production.
exactly. Yeah. And so what kind of motivated the next project that I'll talk very briefly about is, okay, if this isn't happening in like the Hillsborough River, maybe like in some of the lower nutrient ecosystems, just in the West Florida Shelf, we have a lot of springs along this coastline, maybe at least on this coastline, discharging right into the Gulf of Mexico. These are now lower nutrient environments compared to like the Hillsborough River that might have like a significant signature from these cave chemosynthesizers showing up. And so this is where the salt marsh comes in. So this is like the very last segment of the talk. And this is the motivating question here. Does cave chemosynthesis influence our coastal landscapes? And so below this salt marsh is Double Keyhole Spring, which is something that this is my project for my last postdoc when I was up at Woods Hole. And so let me talk about some of some things about this project too. So here's Filman Bayou, which is just an estuary along the Gulf Coast by like Hudson, Florida. Double Keyhole Spring is like the headwater of this estuary. Here's an image of there's a little floating dock here, but there's mangrove swamp around it, and it's a super cool site. Some preliminary work we did showed that there are like iron oxidizing and sulfur oxidizing taxa in the spring water. So these are the bugs that would be doing chemosynthesis. So that gave us like a little bit more motivation to get in there and see what's going on. We also knew that this cave has a halocline. So this tells us that, okay, there might be chemosynthesis going on in this cave. So let me give you like a cartoon of what's going on in Double Keyhole. So here's what I was talking about. This is like Sewanee limestone. This is an example from Ocala limestone. These are just like different limestone units that are bearing this cave. So if you come in through the estuary, you're getting down, the most of the cave is about 300 meters, 100 feet deep. When you swim far enough, about 1,500 feet back into the cave, you enter a room that is 30 feet here. So you can actually see like salt marsh roots coming down from the cave ceiling all the way down to 300 feet down here. The visibility of the cave is about like 5 feet. And so you can't see this, but you know it from like mapping studies or mapping efforts in these caves, or this cave. Hydrologically, there's some interesting haloclines going on too. Deeper water, I'm just describing as polyhalines, so pretty salty stuff. As you enter this deep room, you get a wide mixing zone that eventually stabilizes into this mesohaline, this middle salinity zone. And then as you go up to the ceiling, you're getting into fresher water. Here's some images from that. And blah, blah, fractures, blah, blah. And so up in the ceiling, yeah, here's what I'm talking about. That ceiling area below me looks like it's the floor. That's actually the chemocline. This is a bunch of smoky water just coming from like the geochemistry and the microbial ecology of this interface. This interface is only about a few centimeters wide, so a really sharp one first. And then as you get in the mesohaline zone, you've got this really smoky water. And then when you get deep enough into the polyhaline water, you get this like orange snow forming. What we're finding out from our preliminary data, and what I haven't, what I'm not going to like give you plots on because I'm out of time, is that we have reducing conditions up here. We have a lot of iron up there too. As that dissolved iron or reduced iron stays dissolved in solution, as that iron interacts with oxygen, whether it's like abiotically or from some of these iron oxide taxa, they oxidize it to Fe3+. It comes out of solutions, flocculates, and eventually comes out of solutions so much that if it, or like at least reacting with some of the maybe organics in the water column too, that is becoming this orange snow, which eventually gets pumped up out of the spring. So most of at least the spring run into Thorn Bayou is just totally covered with this orange slime. It's just really a wonderful place for your microbial version. And so this is a 500 ml syringe, and it's from these water samples and from other instruments that we deployed that we get some stuff to look at. So here's those orange slimes on filters for organic carbon analysis and also for DNA analysis too. These sites of haloclines are where that's where the chemosynthesis is happening. So it's kind of our focus of what we're trying to find and seeing how that process has changed into the like carbon budget, iron budget of the cave, and then maybe nitrogen too. And then looking at the microbes that are there too. And so, yeah, looking at nutrients, looking at stabilizers, different levels of DNA analysis too. And also we deployed some equipment for like looking at long-term flux of nitrogen, iron, other like limiting nutrients that could be contributing to primary production in surface ecosystems too. So let me wrap up. We talked about a lot of caves during this talk, right? These spaces in our aquifer can be big, they can be small. But what's really important for like my research and what I'm interested in is that they're all connected to surface ecosystems somehow. So this flows out, this is Little River again, into a river over here. Sometimes they flow out into the Gulf of Mexico, but really, yeah, what I'm trying to pursue from here is just looking at how aquifer processes are connected to surface ecosystems. So this is kind of my main motivating question when it comes to like this aspect of my research career. So thanks for your attention.
All right, thank you, Mark. All right, thanks so much. I know if you're running to the next class, you can go ahead and go, but otherwise please stick around for a question. And I'd love a question from the room, and then we'll see if there's any from YouTube.
Yeah.
So how did you get into cave diving? Was it just your research or did you have like a personal interest?
Yeah, actually, so I got into cave diving for research, which is not the way everybody does it. And so yeah, so my grad school adventure was moving down from Kansas to Tampa, and like that first summer before I started, I went for my certification in space with that whole summer training for that, and then yeah, so that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, Patrick.
What do you think, like, you kind of mentioned that chemosynthesis was not super important probably in terms of overall energy production in that particular cave. In other caves and like throughout these types of systems, does that vary quite a bit, or is it usually, do you think like the export of primary production, derived sources is more important overall?
It's a good question. So, and what we see like within cave ecosystems, like chemosynthesis definitely plays like a huge role in like the food webs internally.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do here is bring it out to like things that I don't know, I don't want to say matter more, but matter more broadly to more people, to more types of ecosystems. And what we're seeing from the preliminary stuff from the Stumble Keyhole study is that like maybe what I was hoping for, which was, okay, it's going to contribute to like the carbon budget of these systems, may not be playing out so well as, okay, these microbes, though, even though they're not making that much carbon, they are cycling things like nitrogen and iron and all this chemistry that's involved in that production of the carbon, kind of as a kind of an auxiliary process. That's kind of where the focus of the Stumble Keyhole project is going. Is how is that process changing like the nitrogen flux and the iron flux of the spring, rather than focusing on the carbon, just because we're seeing that the carbon story just isn't, it's just not there, which is sad.
All right, one last question. Megan, anything from YouTube? We got a comment from Mary Moffat that it's really cool the newer limestone is so crumbly. It makes sense why Indiana is so much more solid since it was covered by a shallow sea 400 million years ago.
There we go.
So, yeah. You're helping contextualize everyone's limestone understanding. Yeah. Yeah. One more question. We can do it. We can do it. Peanut gallery? Nothing?
Do you think that there's like a dynamic interaction taking place between what you're seeing in Double Keyhole and the marsh above? Like, do you have any hypotheses about those interactions? Especially if the root system's so deep, like that's like as a coastal wetland
Yeah,
ecologist.
for sure. It seems like the geochemistry of that upper layer, that oligohaline layer I had labeled, is driven by just what's happening with all those just organisms. Right? So just like this, the removal of oxygen, if you have a lot of just heterotrophic processes happening there too. This iron is probably coming from the siliciclastic sediments from above that limestone too. So it does seem like yeah, the stuff going on in the salt marsh above the cave is definitely influencing that upper layer. But yeah, the whole story, or a big part of the story of double keel is the iron cycling, and that means yeah, those contributions of that contribution of iron is super important. So yeah, that's so great question. Yeah, I really love coupling subsurface and surface processes.
All right, let's give Dr. Sharping one more round of applause. Thanks, everyone. So you should see the seminar, the write-ups are being graded. So we at least got 1 week under my belt. I don't know how you're doing.
Yeah.
1 or so.
Yeah.
You're caught up. So we'll see you next Wednesday.